Commute today, nice and cold. Well, tomorrow is Martin Luther King Day, just in case you didn't know. So the famous I Have a Dream speech, that people would be treated equally and with dignity and respect. And so it's become a day of service to the community and to others. And so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that as we went through this today. Our study today is about a familiar name and a familiar story. You ever heard the phrase, the patience of Job? If not, you should have. It's in James chapter 5 and verse 11. We're going to take a little closer look at Job. And again, our verse for the month, if we could get our verse for the month. Our verse for the month, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. Again, this is timely, it's important, it's useful, and we all need to know that someone cares. And that's what we find in this verse in 1 Peter. Well, let's get on with this guy named Job. Job chapter 1, verse 1, we find this verse. This is from the New Living Translation. There once was a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. He was blameless, a man of complete integrity. He feared God, and he stayed away from evil. So introductions are important. It's important that you know about this guy named Job. It's a real short profile, but it sounds like he's this really, really good guy. And we really want to see a little bit more about this good guy. And the question I have, obviously, is this, is what can we learn from one man's story? I mean, this is one man. What are we going to learn about life from one man's story? Can we see God's hand in the good times and the bad? Can we reconcile why bad things happen to good people? Notice I've highlighted that word, why. There's much to learn from Job's story and his life and his words about why. You know what the definition of the word why is? For what reason or what purpose? And so as you begin to think about that in the context of Job, you begin to think, okay, now, I know a little bit about Job, and we'll talk more about him, but again, how does this fit together? And is there a difference between physical and emotional pain? And if I was to come to you and ask you to describe the differences, maybe as we go through this, you'll see what that difference is. Could we answer the question why things happen when we look around and see our world? There's evil present, there's suffering, there's famine, there's drought, there's floods, there's all these different things going around. And I'm reminded of what Job said. Job drew some conclusions about life, and this was from his experiences. He says in Job chapter 14 and verse 1 from the New Living Translation, how frail is humanity, how short is life, how full of trouble. A man that in King James says a man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. So most in the room, if I was to go around the room and ask, most in the room could draw some similar conclusions about what you've experienced as you've gone through life. It's not fair, is it? And it's difficult at times. And we might all agree to that. And you would say, well, no, I don't want to say that. Well, you don't have to. I'm saying it. These are things, evaluations that we make of life. What can we learn from one man's story? Well, again, key event number one, Job experienced a great time of blessing. So if we start out looking at Job and Job's life, we find out who Job is. We see his character. He's a blameless, upright, God-fearing person. So right away we say, hey, this is a good guy. He was part of a large family that he loved. He was married. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he cared about them, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And he had material possessions. He had livestock, he had servants, he had houses. So Job pretty much had it going on. And if we lived in Uz at that time, we would probably want to be Job's neighbor, with a few maybe exceptions. Well, let's think about Job for a minute. He was a man of prayer, and he cared about his family, and this idea of intercession pops up. Notice in Job chapter 1, verse 5, I'm giving you this from the New Living Translation. It says this, he would get up early in the morning. I like that guy. I'm an early riser too. And he would offer a burnt offering for each of them. This is talking about his children. For Job said to himself, perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular practice. So all of us in the room can be intercessors. You can pray for your family. You can pray for your family members. Job did. And Job was sensitive when he was thinking about his children. What if they did something that they shouldn't have done? What if they're not following God the way they should? Ever feel that way about your own kids sometimes? Probably, if we're all honest. Job was a concerned father. So he's got this big family, and he's married, 7 sons, 3 daughters. Everything is really rolling along. So again, no surprises. Circumstances change, though, don't they? And everyone in the room can agree to that. But for the moment, Job is in a really, really good place. Job's life's not static, neither is yours or mine. Things change. Changes come, sometimes frequently, and many times very unexpectedly. Well, notice Job chapter 1, verse 8. Again, from the New Living Translation. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? I love this. He is the finest man in all the earth. Now, just imagine having a conversation with God, and God says that about you. He's looking at Job thinking, Job's got it going on. He's blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God. He stays away from evil. Wow. How could you ask for anything more than that? Well, Satan is upset about it, obviously. He doesn't like it. He's going to make some challenges and issue some challenges. Notice, Satan challenges Job's relationship to God, and he says Job only serves because he's blessed. If you take away all those blessings, he's going to curse you. Well, he's following for the benefits. I want you to recall John chapter 6 for a moment. Remember, that was where the fishes and the loaves, the story there, and all these people are following Jesus, and there's this question about whether some of them are just following for the things that they can get out of it. The challenge is real, isn't it? Because sometimes that's the only reason people arrive. But we're glad that they arrive. Well, emotional pain was coming. A number of events are going to happen in Job's life. And for those of you that are Bible readers, you know what they are. And they're going to bring emotional pain. And these are the losses that he incurred that challenge his emotions. Here we go. He lost his livestock. And then as you read the story, before the guy gets through telling him that, someone shows up and says, your servants are gone. And before he ends up getting all of that message, he lost his children. Wow. Things happen, don't they? And in this instance, these were very close. He lost his things. They're gone. He lost his close associates, his servants, if you will. They're gone, and his children are gone. And this all happens relatively quickly and in rapid succession. So as I thought about that, I thought if you let that sink in for just a moment, and you're the receiver of that information, you can know or you can tell why there would be such emotional pain. And I thought about this related to a diagnosis that floats around today, post-traumatic stress disorder. You experience such loss or such pain that this, you may not know it at the moment, but later you begin to feel it. Well, what happens? What do you do with this level of tragedy? It's overwhelming, isn't it? It's overwhelming to even think about. How could one person endure or take that much tragedy? Well, this is what happens. What does he do? He says, then Job arose, he rent his mantle, he shaved his head, and he fell down upon the ground, and he worshiped. Job chapter 1, verse 20 from the King James. Grief and worship were on display. So I have the question there, why worship? You've just experienced such loss. Why worship? This was more than a normal person could probably expect in a lifetime, to lose everything. Unless we went to some war-torn country or, maybe a tragedy with, a flood or something happens, you could lose everything very quickly. That's why we should hold things loosely, because, there are no promises. Well, he had to turn to someone, or he had to turn to something, and he chose to turn to God. And I like what we find in going back to the book of John again, John chapter 6, verse 68. What were Peter's words? To whom shall we go? To whom shall we go? So Job has all this tragedy that comes his way. And you think, wow, that's an awful lot. And notice what we find in verse 22 of chapter 1. In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. But Job's trouble wasn't over. You get to this point where there's a pause. You think, oh, man, if I can just get over this hurdle, this stuff that has come my way, this stuff that I'm having trouble dealing with, if I can just get a moment to catch my breath. Ever been there? Ever felt that way? So much coming at you. You just want, can I put a pause button out there for a minute? I need time. So all the emotional pain of loss and grief that had come his way, now we get to the point where he's going to have some physical pain. Physical pain. Job wasn't going to catch a break. More's coming. And notice Job chapter 2, verse 5. But reach out and take away his health. And this is Satan talking with God. Reach out and take away his health, and he will surely curse you to your face. Satan continued the attack. I think that's important for all of us to understand. You may feel like, okay, I'm in a good place right now, but just remember, Satan's out there. He goes about, what does the Bible say, as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So we have to be on guard. But the other thing that's interesting about this, and one of those things that we'll talk just in a moment about, God allowed this trouble. Now let that sink in for a minute. God allowed this trouble to come Job's way. And there's that nagging word again. Why? Why? Why would God allow this to happen? The scene's overwhelming. Think about this. Job's friends show up to see him. Notice the last part of that verse, Job 2:13. His grief was very great. Job's in a situation he doesn't understand. He's suffering emotionally and physically. And I just say to you, can you relate? And then we get to that question, why? You ever ask God why something came your way? And you're like, oh, no, I would never do that. Well, sometimes our weakness, gets the better of us. Why, God? Why? Why did you allow this to happen? His friends sit down with him, and it's just amazing, isn't it? Because they sit down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him. Now, can you imagine walking into a scene like that? What do you say? There is nothing to say, is there? It's just to be there. Well, in all this, Job's wife's looking at this, and she's, her words, just curse God and die. She's overwhelmed by this as well, I'm sure. And Job's friends, they're shocked by what they came into and what they see. And then we have the words of a friend. Think about this for a moment. Eliphaz speaks up and he says, I'm ad-libbing here a little bit, okay? So give me some grace. My experience kind of shows that those who plant trouble and cultivate evil, they kind of harvest the same. So all of a sudden, Eliphaz is looking at the circumstances and trying to reason them out within his frame of reference. You ever do that? Well, brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so, if this, you got to be careful because, this is, We do, don't we? We try to rationalize, reason, come up with some logic of why things are happening. Eliphaz is just trying to figure out why. Why? 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 Well, he's looking at this scene, he's trying to make sense of it, and can I just say for just a moment, sometimes we would be much further ahead if we just stayed silent. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. You just need to be there as support. But, Eliphaz, he's a good friend. He shows up. Job's in trouble. They're all there. They're like seeing all this, and he's trying to figure this out for him. Well, many times there's just no way to explain what comes our way. Have you had things like that happen in your life where there's just no explanation? But it's here. What do I do with it? How do I deal with it? Trust. Trust. Oh, that's so simple for me to let that roll off my tongue. But if I'm going through difficulty, or if I'm going through challenging times, or if I've got emotional pain or physical pain, it's a part of my life and my experience, it's a little more difficult to trust because of that nagging word. Why? Why? Well, notice Job. Now he's getting a little snippy with his friends, if you will. Notice Job 19, verse 1 from the NIV. These two verses are, how long will you torment me and crush me with your words? All right, Eliphaz, you've said enough. You need to be quiet. And so as well, the other friends. So if you read the whole account, you see, they're trying to make reason of this, and they're trying to tell Job, hey man, all this stuff doesn't come along unless you did something wrong. And Job knew in his heart he hadn't. And notice what he says. He says, have pity on me, my friends, have pity. And notice this conclusion that he makes. The hand of God has struck me. Remember, let's go back a few slides. God allowed this to happen. No, God would never do that. I didn't make it up. I read it in the Bible, so it must be true. Didn't see it on the internet, but I saw it in the Bible, so. Job wanted those around him to know of his trust in God. Job had listened to their reasoning. He had listened to their questions, but they just weren't sensitive to his state of mind. This is why sometimes it's better to be quiet. Because they hadn't experienced that. They walked into this grief, but they hadn't experienced what he was going through. So how in the world could they possibly relate to it? Sometimes we try, don't we? We try to relate to situations, and it's common of us as human beings. We want to be empathetic, if you will, and sometimes we try to draw comparisons to what maybe we're going through with what someone else is going through and saying, oh yeah, I went through that at one time or another. Shut up. Just listen. But we do that, and here Job is with all this emotional pain, with all this physical pain, and now he's having to deal with friends that are really not sensitive to where he is and what he's experiencing. So he continues to trust God. The hand of God has struck me. Well, where would you go from there? Well, Job begins to really talk about God and what God has done for him. And he says in Job 19:25 from the King James, most of you probably know this verse, and I highlighted the second and third word, I know. I know. Job has this confidence that his Redeemer lives, and he's going to stand again at the latter day on the earth, Job 19:25. So, let's ask the question. When's God going to intervene? Hello, God, you see me? I've got all these issues going on. Why? 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 As I prepped for this lesson, I was trying to figure out, how do I answer that question? Why? Can I tell you in full disclosure? I can't. There are things that will come into your life, my life, that I cannot answer that question with any certainty, other than to say it was allowed by God for a reason, and I should look for the reason. Wow. Well, and these are logical questions, aren't they? I'm God's servant. I've trusted him. Hey, are you going to help me? You promised. You promised you'd never leave me and never forsake me. Why am I going through this? Well, as we find with Job's friends, there are so many opinions and very few real answers. And we probably have all been that person that's carrying that opinion about what's going on and not really having a real answer. There is a song that's sung here often, and the lyric goes like this: the God I serve is what? He's a mighty big God. So I can trust in him if I'm willing, but I won't necessarily know why when all the circumstances are pointing to challenges and difficulty in my life. Well, Job experiences this time of humbling, and I think it's very important for us to understand this, because all of a sudden God starts asking the questions. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Job 38:2. God saying, you have no knowledge of what's going on here. Where were you when I did all of these wonderful things, created the earth and all that was in it? The tables turn and God's voice becomes part of the conversation. What do I really know about God's plan? Think about that for a minute. I read about it, but his personal plan for my life, I think that's why so many times people say, I really want to know what God's will is for my life, because we don't really know the full story, do we? Well, what I do know is I need to fully trust in his ways. After all, his ways are not my ways, and I didn't make that up. Isaiah chapter 55 tells me that, verses 8 and 9. Well, can I say that most of us would admit at times we get tired, we get frustrated, and sometimes we feel just overwhelmed with some of the circumstances that we face. It's true. We're human, aren't we? We're human. And these situations come that, can be overwhelming. And we find ourselves in the same place that Job was in with all that had come his way, and we ask the question, why? There's that nagging word again. How can a 3-letter word bring so much chaos? Why? Well, again, full disclosure, I can't answer that. Don't be disappointed in me. I tried. I looked. I studied. But there's not a good answer to that question of why. And then I'm reminded of the lyrics of another song. The old timers in here, you'll know this one. We'll understand it better by and by. When the morning comes. Well, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You are God's critic, but you do not have the answers. Job 40 and verse 2. So when people come to you and start saying, hey, well, why does God allow this? Why did God let this happen? I would tell them, hey, I'm not God's critic. I don't know why. I can't answer that. But I can trust him, that he's sovereign, that he's almighty, that he's caring. Cast all your cares upon him because he cares for you. Well, then we get, obviously if I get reprimanded by God, I'm going to take a different path, and that's what we find with Job. Job answers back, you ask, who is that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? And Job says, it's I. And I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. Now, Job recognizes something, that he's sort of overstepped, because you start thinking about all the things and all the complaints that Job made of his situation and his circumstances after his wonderful friends had just told him it was all your fault, Job. And so here he is, trying to reconcile all this, and he can't get beyond that question of why. And here he does. And Job becomes repentant for how he had responded during those times of difficulty. So there's a caution for us, isn't there? When we get into a situation of difficulty that we don't understand and we want to blame God, maybe take a time out and back up a step before you start blaming God. Because who are you to be the critic of God? God allows things to come our way. He had tried to talk about things he just didn't understand. Some things you're not going to have an explanation for. Somebody's going to come to you and they're going to say, why did God let this happen? And reason and logic and experience are going to fail you because it won't provide an answer. And all of a sudden, I just have to accept the fact that this was God's will. Wow. It's easy to roll off the tongue. But if I'm having emotional pain and I'm having physical pain and I just can't get through it, sometimes it's very, very hard to accept, isn't it? Well, once Job repents, then life begins to change a little bit for him. Notice this. Job 42, 7 through 17. From the New King James, it says, "Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. For he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He was restored. Things began to improve. But it was a long process. Grief is a long process, isn't it? It's hard to get through grief sometimes. It's hard to manage it because it keeps popping up, and you wonder why. Well, God worked in his life with his family and his home, and it was all because he trusts. So let's talk about some lessons we can learn. First of all, we need to know that God provides the strength and wisdom we need to endure. You're not going to find it from Dale. You're not going to find it from your friend. Remember Eliphaz, he's like, well, Job, my experience teaches me that because, this. You're not going to necessarily find it there. Oh, they can maybe provide some comfort and sensitivity, but you may not find it in their words. And so notice this, Job 42:10, it says, "And the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before." God is going to provide. Remember Abraham's response to Isaac? Think about a situation. They're going to make a sacrifice. Oh, by the way, Isaac, you're the sacrifice. But Abraham didn't say that. Abraham said, God will provide himself a lamb. What's another lesson we can learn? God uses suffering and difficulty to do what? To strengthen our faith and accomplish his purposes. Verse 11 talks to that. And they consoled him. So Job's got some new friends. He's got some more friends that show up. And these friends, they comfort him, they console him for all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him. Pretty cool, huh? These friends weren't trying to reason out why it happened, just that it happened, and now he needed comfort and consolation. People go through many trials and many troubles in this life. We need to be sensitive, and we need to be empathetic as a church. We need to. We don't have to, and again, this is one of those husband-wife things. Your wife tells you something, you try to solve it, dad, husband, father, No, just be sensitive and empathetic. Listen, because you won't necessarily know why. God may not always tell us why we're suffering, but we can trust his character. Ever think about that? Sometimes we'll never know. We will never know. And the reality of that is God never told Job, the reason this stuff came on you because Satan showed up at one of my meetings one day and he said, what about Job? God never told Job that. I had only heard about you before. This is Job talking. But now I have seen you with my own eyes. Job 42:5. Job's faith was increased through all that he went through. Imagine that. Imagine that. When those difficulties, when those trials, when those pains, when all that comes your way, just remember, sometimes it's to increase your faith. Well, we know Romans 8:28, one of our memory verses from a while back, and you've probably used it. You know, you probably showed up at a friend's house. You're like Eliphaz, and I don't want you to always start comparing yourself to Eliphaz. Oh, we know all things work together for good unto them that are called. Shut up, please. There's a time for that. Ecclesiastes, there's a time. But at the moment of grief and hardship and pain, that's not the time to say to that hurting person, oh, it all works out. Because, again, you're not going through it. And so trying to reason it out from your perspective is the wrong angle to take. That's my opinion. And everyone has one. Remember I said that. There are a lot of opinions and few real answers. Why? Why? Well, what else can we take away? We can take away the fact that we can worship, trust, and bless the Lord even when enduring suffering. And that's easy to print on a screen, but it's a challenge to do in life. But we can do it because Paul even says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, you know, we can endure suffering. He says, thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. And that may be a little out of context, but again, enduring. Get through it. Don't throw up your hands and quit. Imagine that would have been Job. Job got into that point, didn't he? He started complaining. He started trying to logically put this all together. And, you know, God did this and God did that. And then God, you know, sort of set him straight. So we can trust, even when it doesn't have an answer to that one nagging word. Why? Don't let anybody trap you with a question of why. Because sometimes there is no why. There's no answer. I'm out of time. Next up, we're going to talk about the sanctity of life. So Psalm 139 and Luke chapter 1, verses 39 to 44, and in Genesis 1, 26, 28. Let's stand and go to prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We're grateful for all that you've done for us. We're grateful for the blessings that we've received from you, Lord. And I thank you, God, for the presence that you have in this church. Lord, I pray right now for the needs that may be around us today, God. There are people who are suffering physical needs, spiritual needs, financial needs. Lord, maybe they're going through grief, despair, distress, discouragement. Lord, you know where we are in our journey. Lord, I just lift those folks up to you. May the church be a light and a beacon to them. I pray for Josh as he preaches today, God, that you'll use him in a special way. May he share the things that he's learned this week with us, and may it challenge our hearts. We love you. We give you praise for all things because you are worthy. This we pray in your name. Amen. Stay warm.